Hello, my name is Ariele Sieling. I'm a science fiction and fantasy author with over 30 books published, and today I'm going to talk about imposter syndrome. The term imposter syndrome, in my experience, has been kind of used in a way that is a blanket term for a lot of different feelings that people have, particularly in writer communities. So I'm going to go into detail about what imposter syndrome actually is, what kinds of damage it can cause to you and potentially to your career. And then I'm also going to talk about potential strategies for solving imposter syndrome. And this time, I'm going to be taking a little bit more of an academic approach. A lot of conversations about imposter syndrome tend to be very affirmation based, very you can do it, very much, you have the power within you, or whatever. But I really want to get into the nitty gritty about what imposter syndrome actually is and how it can affect you as a creative person and as a writer. I have a degree in interpersonal and organizational communication, which my professors used to call the bastard child of psychology. The discipline focused primarily on theory about, a person and how they interact with the world around them. And I also study psychology for fun because I'm a nerd. I read a lot of books on psychology. I watch a lot of videos. I've taken some courses as an adult on psychology. I just think it's really interesting the way that people think and the way that people's minds works. So the first thing that I want to say before I go anywhere with this topic is that if you have imposter syndrome and it is affecting your life negatively by causing anxiety or depression or preventing you from achieving your goals, you can absolutely see a professional. This is something that a therapist can help you with. Even a life coach could help you with something like this. However, this video is not intended to be a diagnosis of any kind. This is not intended to be therapy. It's just hopefully going to help you understand a little bit better what imposter syndrome is. And then if it's something that you feel like is affecting your life, then you can go and take steps to address and solve for it. I also want to say that if you are experiencing imposter syndrome, you are not alone. A lot of people experience imposter syndrome. I found a lot of different statistics. One of them said 70% of people at some point in their life experience some intensity of imposter syndrome. So if you experience it, you are not alone, and it is a very solvable problem. You do not have to suffer forever from imposter syndrome. If you are intentional, if you acknowledge it, and if you take steps to resolve it, you can move forward from experiencing imposter syndrome. As I was doing research for this, one of the interesting quotes that I found was actually from Maya Angelou, who once said, "Each time I write a book, every time I face that yellow pad, the challenge is so great. I have written 11 books, but each time I think, uh-oh, they're going to find out now. I've run a game on everybody, and they're going to find me out." And I just think that if Maya Angelou had imposter syndrome, a writer who most of us would consider to be one of the greatest writers of all time, of history, if she can experience imposter syndrome, I just hope it can give you a little bit of perspective on the feelings that you are having and how normal they really are. So the first thing I want to do is I want to do a short activity. And because this is a video, I'm not going to do it slow. I'm not going to pause. You can pause the video. But I want you to take 2 minutes, just pause the video, and I want you to write down a list of things that you have accomplished in your writing career. It might be as simple as, I finished a manuscript, or maybe you didn't. Maybe you've participated in a writing event like National Novel Writing Month. Maybe you wrote a short story. Maybe you wrote a poem. Maybe you've published something. Maybe you've published multiple somethings. Maybe you've won an award. Whatever accomplishment you have made in your writing career, I want you to write that down on a list. And then after you have written down the list, I want you to write 1 or 2 sentences about how you feel about those accomplishments. How do those accomplishments make you feel? Like a feelings-focused approach. All right? So you can pause the video, and I'm going to keep talking. So what is imposter syndrome actually? According to the American Psychological Association, imposter syndrome is a psychological state in which people express self-doubt about their accomplishments and skills, despite factual evidence or other people indicating otherwise. And I think that's really key. It's okay to feel insecure if you don't know how to do something, if you're learning how to do something, if you're new at something, if you don't have a lot of practice at something. It's okay to feel insecure, and that's not necessarily imposter syndrome. But if you have evidence that you're actually really good at this, but you feel like you're not, if you feel like you have gotten accolades or achievements that you don't deserve, if other people are giving you compliments and you feel like you have tricked them inside, you feel like you're a fraud, and that any day now somebody's going to figure out that you're not good at whatever it is that you said you were good at or that they say you're good at, that is imposter syndrome. A person with imposter syndrome believes that they have fooled their peers, their co-workers, other writers, maybe readers if you have them, about their accomplishments and skills. They feel like they've tricked them into thinking that they are more competent than they really are. It's like there's a gap in between what you as a writer feel about yourself and your abilities and what you perceive that other people think about your skills and abilities. And this gap can be really stressful, and it can make you feel really guilty, it can make you feel really bad, and it can cause a pretty significant amount of anxiety. Now, I want to really get into the nuances here. So you have true imposters, right? So a real imposter, an imposter is a person who is pretending to be someone that they're not, purposefully and intentionally, usually with malicious intent, right? They are pretending that they have skills so that they can get a particular job, so that they can get a promotion, so that they can get accolades and awards. This person is a true imposter because they actually don't have the skills, they don't have the qualifications, they don't have the experience, and yet they are pretending that they have that to get ahead in some way, shape, or form. Those are real imposters. As opposed to a person with imposter syndrome who feels like they've convinced everybody, who feels like they've done what an imposter is trying to do purposefully, they feel like they've done that accidentally. And it usually comes with a great deal of guilt and stress about it because they don't want to be tricking people, but they don't know how to convince other people that they are not as skilled as they think they are. They also tend to think that most of their accomplishments come primarily from luck. And then you have what are called strategic imposters. These are people who pretend to have imposter syndrome. I'm kind of on the fence about this. I think sometimes there are situations where pretending it could have good intent. Whether or not it has good consequences is a different question. But typically a person is doing this because they want to appear modest. Maybe they're trying to manage the expectations of everyone around them, or stay out of the limelight, or on occasion, they might be trying to show solidarity with someone who really does have imposter syndrome. I wouldn't immediately lump these people into a bad person category, but I do think that it is a form of lying that could potentially be harmful in the long run. And then you just have self-doubt. Now, run-of-the-mill self-doubt can often feel like imposter syndrome, especially if you don't truly understand what imposter syndrome is. But I think it's important to remember that it's okay to feel insecure if you haven't got a lot of experience doing something, if you're new at something, if you don't have awards and accomplishments and you haven't achieved a lot, it's okay to feel insecure. And typically, I would say that the key to moving through this insecurity is to just recognize that you're new at it. And what do you do when you're new at something? You practice, you take classes, you learn, you make friends, and you get better at it until you have achieved those accomplishments. It's imposter syndrome if you feel like you're lying, if you feel like you've tricked everyone, if you feel like everyone thinks you're way more capable than you really are. And it's just insecurity if you just don't have a lot of experience and you know you don't have a lot of experience and everybody else knows that you don't have a lot of experience either. You can't be good at everything immediately. Sometimes you just need time to practice and to level up those skills, and that is perfectly okay. So this can be problematic, imposter syndrome, in a way that regular run-of-the-mill insecurity is not. Because imposter syndrome is based on this fundamental belief about yourself, this negative belief, this probably false belief. And things like positive affirmations and journaling probably aren't going to magically fix it. Like they might help with insecurity, because it's such a deep-seated false belief, and it's probably come from somewhere, right? It probably began somewhere, and it's probably been fed either from your community or the environment that you grew up in, or there's lots of reasons or places that this sort of false belief had come from. But it's really important to address imposter syndrome if you notice that you have it, for a few reasons. The first danger of having imposter syndrome unaddressed and unacknowledged is self-sabotage. And this is a pretty big one. It can mean something as simple as not seeking opportunities, but it could also mean that you're not receiving the rewards and benefits of your skills that you ought to be. It might mean that you're downplaying accomplishments or not trying new things. And you might not be trying to achieve at a higher level for fear of failure. Imposter syndrome can also cause pretty intensive burnout, dissatisfaction with your work and with your life. And burnout is really tough. Burnout can have like a very significant impact on your physical health, on your mental and emotional health, on your family health, and it can have an impact on your work and your community as a whole. And so if you have imposter syndrome, good idea to try to solve it so you can avoid that. Many people with imposter syndromes will also overextend themselves to try to prove their competency. So if you're in a situation where everybody around you thinks you're so capable and you're so competent and you don't, then rather than admitting, to the lie, so to speak, or maybe you've tried admitting to the lie but nobody will believe you, you'll try to work really, really, really hard to prove your competence. Again, this can lead to burnout. It can interfere with your family life. It can make you super tired, super stressed, and it can have lots of negative effects. People with imposter syndrome will also experience severe disappointment when they can't achieve their goals, right? But what ends up happening is they set these like really intense goals because, again, they're trying to prove their competence, but their goals are like too much. So they set intense goals, then they can't achieve those goals, and then they beat themselves up and feel horrible because they can't achieve these like extreme goals that they set. And it creates this like negative feedback loop that feeds that imposter syndrome and makes it more and more deeply rooted in your mind. And then worst case scenario of imposter syndrome is that it can cause anxiety, it can cause depression, and obviously that can very detrimentally affect your health and also potentially cause your death. So it is extremely important to be aware of imposter syndrome if you have it, to be able to identify how it's impacting you, and to have strategies for managing and potentially even healing from it, because out of control imposter syndrome can really have dangerous consequences. And if you are struggling to identify it, but you think you might have it, I think it's really important to open up to somebody else, ask for their perspective, someone that you trust, and see if they can help you solve for this problem that you're having. One of the other interesting things that I learned when I was doing research for this was that imposter syndrome is more common in some groups than others. And this probably doesn't surprise you, but the research I found suggested that in the 1970s they did some research on women in a professional environment and found that women in a professional environment had much higher levels of imposter syndrome than men in a professional environment. And as it was the 1970s, that obviously it probably isn't surprising. But it's not just women. It also is more prevalent among underrepresented racial, ethnic, gender, and religious minorities. And it's particularly from demanding families or like really intense professional environments. And I really want to focus on the professional environments piece here because obviously everybody's family life is different, and where you came from in your childhood, that's going to be different for everybody. But as a writer, we're all kind of in a similar professional environment, and the writing environment, the writing industry is super intense and extremely demanding. The writing community, at a very basic level, can be very judgmental, like very judgmental, right? In a sort of macro way. There's all these rules that people specify or talk about what it means to be a real writer, what your work should look like, what your published products should look like, what your marketing should look like, what your business should look like, what you should be doing. There's all of these rules, I'm going to put rules in quotes there, and they're not necessarily true, but it doesn't change the pressure that we feel from those rules and expectations that writers have towards each other. Not to mention, the expectation for perfection in our industry is completely absurd. It's completely unreasonable. We have this narrative in our industry that every book should be perfect in every way in order for it to be a valuable addition to society. The expectation is the characters should be perfect, the plot should be perfect, the setting should be perfect. You should have all the layers of themes and motifs, and then right down to typos and formatting. And it's not like this anywhere else. Like every book that you look at, if you read through the reviews, you'll find somebody commenting on typos. And it doesn't matter how many times the book has been edited. I'm a professional copy editor. I hire 2 editors to review all of my work. I use AI editing software, right? I have all of these layers in my process, and errors still sneak through. And there's always somebody who feels it's their duty to point out that on page 267 there's a missing space between 2 words. And it's not like this in other places. If you're working in a corporate environment and you send out an email with a typo in it, unless you have one really cranky coworker, most people are just going to ignore it and move on with their life, right? It doesn't matter. It doesn't make a difference. But in our work, it is very much the expectation that it should be perfect in every way. And add to that fact that there's no buffer or barrier between us and the people who are providing us criticism. If you work at a company and you make a product and somebody who bought the product didn't like it, they can complain, but you have a whole customer service department, you have a whole legal department, and you have all these people in between you and the complainers to provide a barrier. The only time the feedback makes it to you is if you are actively going and looking for it, or if it's something that needs to be fixed for the next iteration of the product. And even then, there's somebody else's job to, listen to the feedback, figure out what feedback has value, and then translate that into a way that works for the team who's actually responsible for the products, right? Whereas with writers, it's just us. Even if you're working with a publishing company and you have editors and agents and all these people, it's your name on that book. And if people have issue with it, they have issue with you. And this creates this just really intense, really demanding environment that can be really difficult to exist in, and it can be really bad if you're experiencing imposter syndrome. It can make you feel like an imposter because there's all of these things that you're not doing, all of these things that you're not achieving, and so you end up ignoring all the things that you did achieve and feeling like because you haven't achieved all these other things that suddenly you're a fraud. Add to that fact that there is a ton of stigma in our industry. I think the easiest stigma to talk about is against indie publishing. Indie publishing in its current format has only been around since 2005 to 2008 sort of time period. And immediately people began to talk shit about it. They were really angry about indie authors and people who decided to forego publishing through a traditional publishing company. I have heard all kinds of nonsense about indie authors, everything from they don't edit their books to they can't write good books to they can't possibly be good writers if they don't go through a traditionally published company. Indie authors are just people who are bitter that a traditional company didn't want to publish them, so they publish on their own. And those things are just not true. I've never even submitted to a traditional publishing company because I don't want to be published by them. I love being my own publisher, in addition to being my own writer. But there's all of this. So if you decided to go indie, you have to work your way through these narratives and try to, feel like you are, in fact, legitimate despite what everybody else is saying. Another good example is genre. literary fiction versus genre fiction is a huge debate in the writing community. There are literary writers who don't think that genre fiction is legitimate, and there are genre writers who look down on literary writers. And so we have these like internal battles among ourselves about like what counts as legitimate writing. I'll give you a clue. It's all legitimate. And my third example is the romance genre specifically. People talk crap about romance so much. It's ridiculous. People half the time won't even admit to reading romance when they do. But the romance industry is a billion-dollar industry. It's the biggest genre. It makes the most money out of every genre. It is the most diverse genre. There are so many good things about the romance genre, and yet people still look down on it. They talk bad about it. So if you write romance, it can be really hard to move away from and try to ignore a lot of these narratives and the things people are saying about your genre, and consider yourself legitimate. And so all of these different moving pieces, depending on where you are, what you write, where you are in your career, they can really feed that imposter-y feeling inside you, because you're not living up to everybody's expectations all the time. And even if you get over one type of stigma or narrative, there are cascading narratives. I mean, it's really never ending. It's like if you are like, I'm going to be indie and I think indie publishing is legitimate and real, well, then if you get too far into it, there's all these other narratives like, oh, well, you're not real if you're not making six figures, or like you're not real if you don't have a certain number of books published, or if you haven't won an award, or if you're not publishing every month, or if you haven't gotten bestseller status. Like there's all of these things that it feels like you need to achieve in order to be legitimate. But the truth is, you don't. You really don't. But it can be really, really hard to move through these and get past them when you have this part of you inside that's like, you're not legitimate, and you're lying to everybody and you've convinced everybody. It can be really, really difficult. We work in an extremely competitive, highly speculative, and demanding industry. And there are a ton of variables. You can be doing every single thing right and still not be considered successful by someone else's definition. And that's exactly the kind of thing that feeds that sense of being an imposter. The other thing I wanted to bring up briefly is that most of the time, writers write alone. We write our books alone, we run our businesses alone, we mostly do marketing alone, and occasionally, there's exceptions to the rule. Like if you're co-writing, maybe you're joining a community, and so you're doing sprints or competitions with other people. But generally, when you sit down to create, to craft your work, you are doing so on your own. And so that leaves this like open space for that imposter voice in your mind to just be there and to be telling you, hey, you're a fraud, you're a fraud, you're a fraud. As opposed to like if you're a musician and you're making music with other people, you can voice those thoughts out loud, and the other people around you can help you balance out that narrative by saying, no, you're definitely not a fraud. Do you remember this? Do you remember this? Whereas we have to do that by ourselves. We are on our own most of the time. You have to provide yourself with that positive self-talk, or build it into your life somehow, whether that's through a writing community, or having writing friends, or having a spouse provide you with positive feedback, because the rest of the time we're pretty much on our own. So I want to do an exercise. This exercise actually came from my therapist. It was a recommendation. And because this is on video, I'm going to recommend that you pause and take a few minutes or as long as you need to go through each one of the steps of this exercise. Because for most of us, I'm going to suggest that we don't feel like an imposter all the time, like 100% of the time. Because if we did, we probably never would have started doing the thing that we were doing in the first place. We never would have started writing, or if we had started writing, we would have stopped a long time ago. So there are probably times when we feel like an imposter and times when we don't. So that means that there's a part of us, there's a piece of us that feels like an imposter, but we don't completely feel like an imposter, right? So I want to take an opportunity or take a few minutes to focus your mind on the part of you that feels like an imposter. And if you don't think you have imposter syndrome, if you're just dealing with run-of-the-mill insecurity. You can do the same thing with that insecure piece of your part, of yourself. That insecure part of yourself. You can take a few deep breaths if you want. You can close your eyes if you want. And I'm going to ask you some questions, and you can write the answers to these questions, or you don't have to. You can just think about the answers. It's fine, whatever works for you. We want this to work. So I want you to just take a minute and go into your head, and I want you to focus on the part of yourself that feels like a fraud. Just look for it. What does it feel like? What does it look like? Just try to find inside your mind that piece of you that feels like a fraud. And you can pause right here if you need a minute to do it. Once you have identified that part, the next thing I want you to do is I want you to listen to what it's saying. What is it telling you? You can just listen, or you can write down the thoughts. You can write down what it's saying to you if that is helpful. But just take a couple minutes and listen, and you can pause it here again. After you have listened for a couple of minutes, or as long as you need, I want you to kind of step back metaphorically, and I want you to kind of do a scan of your whole body. I like to imagine like in a sci-fi spaceship, like a medic scan, or like Star Trek. Never mind. Do a whole scan of your body. Start at the top, whatever you need to do. And I want you to notice how you feel. Specifically, do you notice any pain? Do you notice any discomfort? Do you notice any tightness anywhere? And especially note if any part of your body pops into your awareness in a way that you didn't notice before. Because I know a lot of us deal with chronic pain, or you have a headache and you've had a headache for all day or whatever. So focus on anything new, any new sensations that you might feel anywhere in your body. Whenever I do this, focusing on the imposter syndrome part, I always get a tightness in the center of my back, like right to the right of my spine. So take a minute, take a couple deep breaths, and just kind of feel your whole body. You can pause again. Once you've done that, I want you to kind of narrow back in on the imposter-y part of your brain. And I want you this time, instead of just listening to it, I want you to ask it a question. I want you to ask, what are you afraid of? Ask that part of yourself, what are you afraid of? You can pause again. And you can write this down or not, whatever works. Now, once you've done that for a couple minutes, I want you to find the part again, and I want you to ask it again, what are you afraid of? But this time, I want you to focus on what is the fear beneath the fear. Because a lot of times, that initial fear is going to be something kind of surface level, like I'm afraid of being exposed, or I'm afraid of failure. But what is the fear that is triggering that fear? What is the fear beneath the fear? Ask that part of yourself that question, and you can write it down or just think about it. Once you do that, the next thing I want you to do, and this is the last part for this exercise. The next thing I want you to do is I want you to look at that part, focus on that part of yourself, and I want you to ask it, what do you want? You can pause again. Now, you don't have to share this with anybody. This exercise is totally for your benefit, for you to learn a little bit about the part of yourself that feels like an imposter. The exercise is designed to give you access to that part of yourself that feels like it, to kind of like bring it into the light, to bring it forward so that your conscious part of your mind can really see it and talk with it, so that you can be aware of it, so that you can learn more about it, and so that you can develop strategies to help it get what it needs. So I'm going to take a minute here to share a little bit about my own imposter syndrome. When I was actually asked to prepare this for another workshop, and I was like on the fence kind of about doing it, because my initial thought was like, oh, I don't experience imposter syndrome. And the truth is, in my writing life, I don't. I'm very confident in my writing. I'm very confident in the choices that I made. My perspective is basically like, I'm a real writer. And if somebody reads my work and they don't like it, that's a them problem. That's not really a me problem, right? Not that I never feel insecure. I definitely have insecurities about it, but generally speaking, I don't feel like I'm lying to anybody. I don't feel like I've convinced anyone I'm more capable than I am. So I don't experience it in my writing life, but I do have a story about it from when I was younger. I was identified as, when I was a kid, as a gifted kid. I was a former gifted kid, which in the United States, that basically means that my school district determined that I was a smart kid, and they put me into like advanced classes. So I was kind of like pushed through all my coursework, and then by the time I graduated from college, I had taken all of these college credits. Like I could take college courses in high school that then transferred to college when I got to college and all that jazz. But the thing was, for me, I was a second child. I have two brothers. My older brother, Gary, is a software engineer. My younger brother, Evan, is a musician. And the thing was that I was the middle child, and Gary, my older brother, was 3 years older than me. And he was like the real gifted kid. He like skipped a grade. He graduated from a 5-year college program in 3.5 years. He used to take 22 credit hours while he was like sick. He had this like massive course load. He was the kind of kid who like bought a computer. This is in the 90s. So he like bought a computer from a school auction, and took it apart and put it back together again. He like borrowed calculus textbooks from his math teacher in high school so he could teach himself calculus over the summer, so he can teach himself how to program in C++. Like, this is the kind of gifted version, or the version of gifted, that my older brother was. And so I always had this kind of sense that I wasn't smart at all. It was kind of like I was never really good at math. I wasn't as good at science as him. The only thing that I was as good at was writing. And as you probably know, our society does not value writing in the arts in the same way that they value math and science. And so I went through this whole period of my life terrified that somebody was going to figure out that I wasn't as smart as they thought I was. I was terrified that somebody was going to make me take an IQ test or a Mensa test or something like that, and it was going to oust me as this fraud. I had been labeled by the outside as this like extremely intelligent child, and then I was like really, really worried. But my context was completely off, right? And I had a demanding family who I love dearly, but they had a lot of very high expectations, and my school really fed that. They put me in all of these advanced level courses. They told me I had to go to college. I wasn't even allowed to look at the like trade programs that were available in my school. I asked my guidance counselor, and he just told me no. No, you have to go to college. And I didn't really move past this sense of imposter-ness at all until I went to college. And I was suddenly like smack dab in the middle. Like, I got decent grades, but I was not one of those 4.0 students. But I also was not like a low scoring. And I was like, okay, this feels like a much better place for me. Like, okay, maybe I'm not like my brother, but suddenly the world and myself seem to kind of agree on where I should be. So in my case, the imposter syndrome at least somewhat lessened on its own, but it doesn't always do that. Sometimes it can last and last and last, but it doesn't have to. You don't have to wait for it to magically go away. And in fact, if you do wait for it to magically go away, it probably won't. I got lucky, but it probably won't. You can actively take steps to help solve for it. And the first step, always, in my opinion, the first step is acknowledging that you have imposter syndrome in the first place, and then committing to doing intentional work to solve it. I'm not convinced imposter syndrome can be solved if you don't first admit that you have it. So I'm going to go over a couple of strategies, and I want to say that these strategies I'm providing are generalized. They're ones that I got off the internet, ones I talked to my therapist about this, and there's some suggestions that she gave me. But if none of them sound right to you, you might need a customized solution, and that's totally fine. You can create a solution for yourself. You can ask for help from people that you know, people in your community, your family, and you can go see a therapist. You can find a professional to help you work through this. This is something that therapists are really good at. So if you're comfortable doing that and you have the means, it's definitely worth looking into. So the first strategy I have is that you should know you are in control of your own thoughts. Sometimes your thoughts emerge, they arise. You can't always control exactly what they're going to be, right? That's why we have things like intrusive thoughts. But you can control how you respond to them, and you can take steps to manage your thoughts. Steps include meditation. You can do deep breathing exercises if you're not into meditation. Exercise can really help. Positive affirmations can really help. And if you do positive affirmations, I recommend that you customize them to yourself and your own needs rather than just Googling generic positive affirmations. You can Google them to get an idea of what might help. But I think generally speaking, it's a good idea to customize them to yourself, so you're targeting your own anxieties and your own fears and not just kind of generally saying things that may or may not help. Journaling can also work for people depending on who you are and what you want and what you're looking for. Journaling is definitely an option. Reframing can also be really helpful. If you're not familiar with Becca Syme, she has a concept that she talks about in her book, Dear Writer, You Need to Quit, called questioning the premise. And this is not a new concept necessarily. I just like the way she phrases it. Question the premise. I used to call it deconstructing the narrative. Deconstructing the narrative is much more of a mouthful than question the premise, or QTP as she calls it. But basically, you can ask the question, but is it? But is it true? To any narrative that you have in your head. So if you have that imposter voice in your head saying you're a fraud, you can literally talk back to it and be like, am I though? Like, am I though? And you can question that narrative, and you can question every other narrative. Like, if you have a belief in your head that like a real writer is published by a traditional publishing company, you can say, are they though? Like, is that really true? Virginia Woolf was indie. Is she not a real writer because she wasn't published through a traditional publishing company, right? Hugh Howey made millions. Is he not a real writer because he wasn't published through a traditional publishing company? You can do it for like, oh, I use adverbs. Real writers don't use adverbs. Don't they though? Like, just go pick up a book and you will find an adverb in it of any well-known writer. So you can question the premise, and if you do this frequently and make a practice of it, it can slowly dismantle some of those false beliefs that feed the imposter. It may also be helpful, depending on the type of person that you are, to review the evidence. Keep a list of your accomplishments. I actually have a book that I keep called Encouragement for Me, and it's just a binder, and sometimes if I get a nice note from a fan, I'll print it off and put it in the binder. If I go to an event that I'm proud of, like my first conference ever, I had a photo of me at the conference and I put it in my binder. One time, my local newspaper from the town that I grew up in did like a press release on the new book that I published, so I printed that out. And you can keep track of your accomplishments. I came across an Instagrammer recently who writes down what she accomplished at the end of every single day, and at the end of the year she can go back and see all of the things and all of the different ways that she spent her time that year, which I think is a cool concept. So yeah, you can track your accomplishments if you want to. You can review the evidence whenever you're feeling overwhelmed, or whenever that voice gets really loud in your head. Might work for you or might help. Another concept that I think is really helpful is to ask, did something trigger this feeling? And I think what you'll find a lot is that if you start paying attention to triggers, you'll start to find some patterns. And a lot of these triggers you can remove from your life. And if I was going to make one recommendation to the majority of authors and writers who I have engaged with, I would say leave the 20 books to 50K group. And I'm not targeting this at their overall marketing and business method. That's fine, whatever. I'm specifically talking about those posts that people like to make where they like screenshot their like sales data and write like a 6,000 word essay about why and how they were successful. those I'm still technically in the group, but I muted it. Those, every single time I read them, make me feel horrible. And it doesn't matter that I have 37 books published, right? It doesn't matter that I get paid a lot of money to give workshops around the world. It doesn't matter. None of my accomplishments and achievements matter when I see those, because it's like I am not doing what they're doing. And it automatically triggers, if I'm going to feel insecure, if I'm going to feel impostery at all, those posts 100% do it to me every time. So pay attention to when that voice wakes up and starts yelling at you. And if you can, remove those triggers from your life. It might mean quitting social media. It might mean leaving the 50 books group. It might mean leaving a local writers group if you find that they're not being healthy and supportive of you. So that's just one, potentially minorly controversial suggestion. And then finally, I have 2 more strategies. Talk about it with a friend, with your, people who you trust, your spouse, a therapist, a mentor. Talk about it. Keeping that to yourself is probably the worst thing that you can do, because it's just going to feeling like you can't tell people about it. It's only going to exacerbate that feeling that you're lying, which is going to exacerbate the sense of being a fraud. So pick even just one person to talk to about it, who you are confident that you can trust. And then the last thing I want to say is, I think it's really important to have some self-compassion, to look at yourself and be able to say, I am going to feel insecure sometimes. I am not perfect at everything. I don't have to be perfect at everything. I am allowed to be in the place that I am at in my life. These impostery feelings that I'm having are not my fault. And to just view your situation with self-compassion. View that part of yourself as a part that is trying to help you, maybe in a bit of a destructive way, but it assume positive intent. And I think self-compassion is really important for healing and for moving forward from imposter syndrome. So, do you remember at the beginning of this, I had you write a list of your accomplishments and your achievements, and then write a couple thoughts about it? I think you should do that again. Review the list. Maybe you want to add a few things to it that you kind of were like, oh, that doesn't count, right? You can add to it. Maybe you feel a little differently now after having gone through this and doing the exercise. What would you write differently than you would have 45 minutes ago? That's all I have. That's my talk on imposter syndrome. I hope it's helpful to you. And if you are experiencing imposter syndrome, I'm really sorry. But just know you are not alone. You are not alone. And there is hope. It is a very solvable problem. You just have to be willing to acknowledge it and be intentional about solving it. So, thank you for listening, and good luck.